This lecture is about Prophet Muhammad, the Rashidun Caliphs, and the treatment of the religious other during this period. In this lecture, we are going to explore the treatment of the religious other by both the Prophet Muhammad and, after his death, by the Rashidun or Rightly Guided Caliphs. We will examine some key historical documents from this early time to see how Prophet Muhammad in particular and the Rightly Guided Caliphs who came immediately after him approached the question of the religious other. Let us look at the issue of religious affiliation and tribal norms in pre-Islamic Arabia very briefly. In an earlier lecture, we covered pre-Islamic Arabia and how interreligious relations existed at that time. We remember that before the advent of Islam, social responsibility, cultural identity, and protection of the individual were very much based on tribal norms in pre-Islamic Arabia. What this means is that by and large, tribal relations and concerns took precedence over any religious affiliation in general. In pre-Islamic times, in Mecca and surrounding regions, for example, whatever religious affiliation one might have, that person's tribe or clan would protect him or her against any attempt to harm him or her by any outsiders. Tribal affiliation gave the protection to an individual regardless of one's religious belief, that is, an individual from one's clan or the tribe. That was the general principle. This was also the case with the young Muslim community at the time of the Prophet Muhammad in Mecca. This is the very early period of the Muslim community. Even though a good number of people from the tribe of Quraysh in Mecca, that is the dominant tribe, converted to Islam, by and large their clans protected them. This is despite the fact that the clans often were strongly opposed to Prophet Muhammad's teachings and therefore the new religion. Even then, the tribal norms dictated that members of the clan should be protected and those outside the clan should not harm them. Such protection was afforded to the Prophet Muhammad himself from his clan in Mecca. Even though many members of the clan of the Prophet were opposed to his teachings, they were bound by the tribal norms that the clan should protect him. Those converts to Islam in Mecca who did not have clan protection were often persecuted and tortured. Let us now look at the Quran and the religious other briefly. The question for us is, does the Quran say much about how Muslims should interact with the religious other? As far as the Quran is concerned, it has a lot to say about how Muslims should engage with, interact with, and relate to the religious other. This religious other can be a polytheist, a Christian, or a Jew. Mostly these were the ones that are mentioned in the Quran in the context of the Prophet's time. Because there were no other major religions present in Mecca and Medina and surrounding regions, the Quran probably did not refer to other religions such as Buddhism or Hinduism. A couple of other religions are mentioned in the Quran, of course, but not Buddhism or Hinduism. The Quranic view of how Muslims should relate to the religious other is complex. Unless one reads the Quranic texts in their proper contexts, it would be hard to make sense of some of the texts. A few of these texts can be very harsh in their tone and may appear to discourage, even perhaps prohibit, certain relationships with the religious other. But many other texts strongly encourage Muslims to have good relations with the religious other. Much depends on the context of any particular Quranic text. The key question is to what extent this religious other is prepared to relate to Muslims in a peaceful and harmonious way. If the religious other has that kind of approach, that is, a peaceful approach, the Quran also encourages good, peaceful, and positive relations with the religious other. The issue from a Quranic point of view is not difference in religion as such, but the attitude of the religious other towards Muslims and the Muslim community. It is important, therefore, that one reads Quranic verses related to inter-religious relations with a close eye on the social, political, and historical context of each verse. That context would be essential for understanding the very strongly worded negative verses and the very strongly worded positive verses. Apart from such very strongly worded verses, there is a lot in the Quran that suggests that from a Quranic point of view, certain ideas should be taken for granted. First, that all people must have the necessary freedom to believe or not to believe in the new religion or Islam, and that no one, not even the Prophet Muhammad or a ruler of the Muslim community, can force anyone to convert to Islam. The famous Quranic verse, "Let there be no coercion in matters of faith," can be cited as a good example. Second, that Muslims and non-Muslims within the same community should be able to live together harmoniously and maintain good social relations. Third, that there is no requirement whatsoever to separate the Muslims from the non-Muslim community, except when the non-Muslim community, for example, oppresses the Muslim community or wants to force Muslims to move away from their religion and the like. What this means is that from a Quranic point of view, religious difference is not a barrier for good social relations between people. As far as the Prophet Muhammad's attitude and approach to the religious other are concerned, we will look at some examples. They will demonstrate that his attitude was not different from that of the Quran. Let us now look at an example, which is the case of Muslims living under a Christian ruler during the Prophet's time. One of the most important concerns in the earliest Muslim community was the persecution of Muslims by the opponents of the Prophet in Mecca. Because of this severe persecution of Muslims, the Prophet Muhammad asked his followers at the time to leave Mecca and go and seek protection with a Christian ruler. This Christian kingdom was just across the Red Sea in modern-day Ethiopia. The Prophet did not have any problems with the fact that the ruler was Christian and the community to which the Prophet was sending these Muslims was also Christian. Religious difference did not matter from the Prophet's point of view. What was important was whether these Muslims would be able to live a normal life free from persecution. For the Prophet Muhammad, what was most important was the fact that this Christian ruler was just and fair, and the Prophet knew that the ruler would give protection to these persecuted Muslims. Those Muslims would be free to live under the protection of this Christian ruler. The two considerations in the Prophet's thinking then were how fair and just the ruler was and whether the Muslims would have the freedom to practice their religion under the protection of the ruler. In fact, one could say that Muslims were able to practice their religion freely for the first time under this Christian ruler in the midst of a Christian community. This is perhaps one of the most important examples that one can find from the Prophet's life about his attitude towards Muslim and non-Muslim relations, in this case, Muslim-Christian relations. Let us now look at the Charter of Medina as an example. Here we are looking at Muslim-Jewish relations. The Charter of Medina is sometimes referred to as Constitution of Medina. So we will be using the two terms interchangeably. The Charter of Medina is a very important document from the Prophet Muhammad's time in Medina. This document was the basis for bringing together people of different religious traditions, in this case Muslims and Jews in Medina, and also people from different tribes. The document provides a range of principles, guidelines, rules, and regulations to manage the relations between these groups, both religious and tribal. The Charter of Medina is considered the people living in Medina, regardless of differences in the religious traditions they followed, that they should be able to live together as equals and harmoniously. Jews and Muslims had equal rights under this charter. Here are some key elements from the charter. It establishes a community, Muslims and Jews of Medina, with common goals. It changes the emphasis from tribal lines that was dominant in pre-Islamic times to religious affiliation. It establishes Medina as a place of protection for all people. All participants are bound to protect the town and each other. It establishes procedures for community justice and law. Participants of the charter or agreement must act in good faith with one another. It grants the parties social, cultural, and religious autonomy. It emphasizes respect for each other's ways of living and beliefs. It encourages participation, not domination. What is noticeable in this document or charter is that the document treats all these people from different tribes and different religions as equal. There is no suggestion that one group is superior to others. It also considers that the people who are parties to this document, despite the differences in religion, form a single community. In a sense, a big community composed of smaller sub-communities. It makes it very clear that people of different religious traditions will have complete freedom to practice their religions. That means under the Charter, Jews and any others, as well as Muslims, should be able to practice their religion freely. The community that is formed by this Charter is therefore above the religion and above the tribe. Common interests such as living harmoniously in peace and security and the defense of the town brought these different people together under this charter. Now think of how such a view could be relevant to today's world in which we are living right now. Obviously, this charter was 1400 years ago. Let us go through some of the key aspects of the charter. As I mentioned in the lecture on pre-Islamic Arabia and religious diversity, the Charter was the first declaration of a political entity for the young Muslim community. The Charter outlined numerous protections for all people living within the bounds of Medina, including Muslims and non-Muslims, in this case mostly Jews. And again, in stark comparison to past tribal conflict and its resolution based on tribal norms, the Charter outlined a novel approach of seeking justice, that is, through law and community instead of through tribal warfare and violence. So it was developing a rules-based approach to maintenance of order and security. Let us just break down the Charter a little bit so we have a bit more evidence to go with. There are many aspects to the Charter, but we will focus on the way that it sought to bring together the different religious groups living in Medina. Again, very briefly. The Charter, for example, addresses interreligious relations very clearly. The Jewish tribes in Medina are described as one with the community of the believers or Muslims. So it forms a single community comprising the Jews and Muslims. It recognizes the difference in the religious groupings, but also insists that they must work together and aid one another against any threat to the security of Medina from outside. The Charter insists on communal advice seeking, For example, it states that Muslims and Jews must seek mutual advice and consultation. We will look at the Charter in more detail in the class. Let us now look at what is called Najran Treaty as an example. This is on Christian-Muslim relations. The Najran Treaty is an agreement that the Prophet Muhammad concluded with a group of Christians from Najran in Arabia. Therefore, the name Najran Treaty. Towards the end of Prophet's life, a Christian group from an area in Arabia called Najran came to Medina to visit the Prophet Muhammad. On meeting this group of Christians, the Prophet concluded an agreement after discussions with them. The Najran Treaty emphasizes toleration and supports an ethic of coexistence. It recognized the difference between Christian and Muslim, but did not insist on conversion of Christians to Islam or anything like that. It emphasizes the right of the Christians to practice their religion and protection of their places of worship and the like. Here are some of the key elements from the Najran Treaty. These elements include Muslims should protect the churches and monasteries of the Christians. They would not demolish any church property either to build mosques or to build houses for Muslims. All ecclesiastical property of the Christians would be exempt from tax. No ecclesiastical authority would be forced by Muslims to abandon his post. No Christian would be forced by the Muslims to become a convert to Islam. And there are a number of other elements as well. An interesting issue related to the delegation of Najran is that despite the differences in religion, various sources tell us that the Prophet Muhammad even allowed the Christians to perform their rituals and prayers in his own mosque. An important question is, what about events from the life of Prophet Muhammad that do not seem to be tolerant towards the religious other? There are, of course, a number of examples cited by various people. So, some of you might be thinking about the various events from the life of Prophet Muhammad that perhaps do not go in line with the picture I have just painted in relation to toleration or even acceptance of the religious other. For example, what about the very harsh treatment of the three Jewish tribes in Medina? Again, I would emphasize that we need to look at the context in which the treatment of these Jewish tribes in Medina occurred. Let us look at the context briefly. You might remember the Medina Charter or the Constitution of Medina I referred to earlier. It says that all parties in Medina were to be part of this charter that includes Jews and Muslims. One of the key requirements and in fact obligations on the parties was to defend Medina against outside aggression or threats by outsiders, in particular the opponents of Muslims based in Mecca. No party in Medina was supposed to provide any kind of assistance to such aggressors. When you look at the three Jewish tribes, you will find that all three of them had violated some of the key terms of the Charter in some very significant ways. For example, by violating the rules dealing with internal security of Medina, or by not defending Medina as they should when required, or by supporting outside aggressors who came to attack Medina. As a result of this, in line with tribal customs and norms of the time, and in line with the Charter, each tribe was punished. Two tribes were expelled from Medina, and in the third case, which is the harshest one, adult men were executed and the rest were enslaved. If we could take the third case, which is the harshest, as an example, we could say the following. Again, context is important. It was the year 5 of the Prophet's presence in Medina. After two major battles between the Muslims in Medina and their opponents from Mecca over a 4-year period, the Meccan opponents of the Prophet came for a third time with a 10,000 strong army. This time they were determined to completely destroy Medinan Muslims. At this very dangerous and difficult time, the Jewish tribe in Medina secretly came to an agreement with the leaders of the Meccan army to help with the invasion. For various reasons, the Meccan army could not enter Medina and had to leave. The Jewish tribe that was part of the Charter of Medina and went against the terms of the Charter by providing assistance to these outside aggressors had to then face justice. The punishment was for their collaboration with the outside aggressors at this most difficult and challenging time for the Medinan community. If the Meccans had succeeded, the entire Muslim community in Medina would have been completely destroyed and killed. What this shows is that it is important to know the context of these events in order to know why certain events took place during the Prophet's time. So when we look at such harsh treatment, we also need to look at why that happened and what kind of values and norms governed such treatment. We need to understand such values in the context of that time. Our values today may be significantly different, and it is not a good idea to apply our values to those events. In relation to the Quranic verses that are extremely harsh to the religious other, again we need to look at who the Quran was addressing in those verses and why. Some of these verses can be found, for example, in the early part of chapter 9 of the Quran. The Quran was addressing certain polytheists and also some Jews and Christians who were working hard to undermine the Muslim community in Medina and constantly attacking it and its religion. By the time we come to more or less the end of Prophet's life in Medina, the Quran emphasized that these enemies of the community, whether they are inside Medina or outside Medina, must be subdued, controlled, and prevented from further attempts at destruction of the community. As far as these people are concerned, there was to be no toleration. They had to be stopped according to the Quran, and therefore you can see in the Quranic language the uncompromising tone and harshness. But for those people who are polytheists and also people of the book, that is, Jews and Christians, who were living at peace with the Muslim community, they were to be treated gently and as members of the community. They were to be fully protected and accepted and tolerated. The issue again is whether the religious other was an enemy or one at peace with the community, in this case, Muslim community. And so, in summary, then the Quran and the Prophet were very clear that the religious other should not be forced to convert to Islam, and the religious other must have the freedom to practice his or her religion and should be treated fairly and gently. And if the religious other insists on becoming an enemy and is prepared to destroy the Muslim community, then such a person or a group should be fought against as part of the defense of the community. The issue is not difference in religion, but the attitude of the other towards the community. Let us now look at how the immediate successors of the Prophet Muhammad, or the leaders of the community, or what is known as Rashidun Caliphs, managed to deal with the religious other after the death of the Prophet. Specifically, we'll be looking at the period of the Rightly Guided Caliphs or Rashidun Caliphs. This is the period from 632 to 661, about 30 years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. We are really talking about four successors to the Prophet, or four caliphs, or the four Rashidun caliphs. The caliphs Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali. The most striking feature of this period is the huge expansion of Islam outside Arabia as a result of military activities conducted by the Muslim state based in Medina. These activities led to the confrontation between the Muslim state and the two empires to the north of Arabia, the Byzantine Empire and the Sassanid Empire. Within a short period of 2 years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, Muslim armies began to conquer large parts of Byzantine Empire and the Sassanid Empire. The Sassanid Empire collapsed very quickly within a few years, and their territories became part of the Muslim state. And much of Byzantine Empire also came under Muslim rule during this period. The question of how Muslims, in particular the Muslim state based in Medina, should deal with the religious other became extremely important and relevant in this context of huge expansion. Large numbers of non-Muslims, Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, for example, were now coming under the control of the Muslim state as a result of the conquests. This is quite different to the way things were when the Prophet was managing the Medina-based state. We don't have time to go into a lot of details, but let me summarize. The Muslim conquest of what we call the Middle East at the time was not always through violence or fighting. There were, of course, battles between the Muslim armies and the armies of the two empires. But very large numbers of towns and regions came under Muslim control through negotiation between the Muslim armies and those towns and regions or territories. Treatment of the people of each territory or town was very much based on how the territory or town came under Muslim control. By and large, territories that came under Muslim control through fighting had more severe terms of surrender. Even then, forced conversion to Islam was not an option. People of the region had still the right to follow their religion. Regions that came under Muslim control through negotiation had much favorable terms. The people were assured protection from external aggression, protection of their life and property and their places of worship, freedom to practice their religion and the like. In exchange, they were expected to pay a tax called jizya. This is an Arabic term. The jizya was primarily a payment to the state in return for this protection. We could call it a form of tax. Those who were protected by the Muslim state in this sense were called dhimmis. Again, dhimmi is an Arabic term. Very briefly, dhimmis were people who followed religions other than Islam and were now under the Muslim rule and were given protection by the state. The Muslim state was to guarantee that protection. So they were becoming citizens of the Muslim state. So the label dhimmi was not a negative one at the time. It simply indicated the kind of relationship that person had to the Muslim state and the protection given by the state to that person. Of course, when you read some literature on dhimmis today, you will find that many consider it to be a very negative idea or institution even at that time. Of course, if we apply our modern values of today, such as equality of citizenship, to that context, the notion of dhimmi would be a negative one from the perspective of our values. But we need to look at these notions and institutions in their contexts at the time. Today, we take equal citizenship for granted, and that is a value that is very important for us today. No one wants to be a second-class citizen in a modern state. But that's not how pre-modern societies functioned. When we look at the terms of various agreements concluded during these 30 years of the Rashidun Caliphs, we will find that this broad picture that I have just painted remains pretty standard. Here is an example from the time of the Rashidun Caliphs, particularly during the time of Omar, the second Caliph. This is from the Treaty of Jerusalem, after the conquest of Jerusalem in 637. It says, "In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, this is the assurance of safety which the servant of God, that is the Caliph Omar, the commander of the faithful, has given to the people of Jerusalem. He has given them an assurance of safety for themselves, for their property, their churches, their crosses, the sick and healthy of the city, and for all the rituals which belong to their religion. Their churches will not be inhabited by Muslims and will not be destroyed. Neither they, nor the land on which they stand, nor their crosses, nor their property will be damaged. They will not be forcibly converted. There are, of course, other texts as part of this treaty, but this gives us a sense of what the treaty was about as far as the religious other is concerned. Let me now mention another important document that is often discussed in the context of Muslim and non-Muslim relations, which is referred to as the Pact of Omar. The Pact of Omar is really a summary of a whole range of rules and regulations in traditional Islamic law that are supposed to govern the relationship between the Muslim state and the non-Muslims who were under the protection of that state. Although this is called the Pact of Omar, many historians question whether this actually belongs to the period of the second caliph, whose name is Omar. Whether or not this goes to that period is not very important for us. What is important is what this document contains, as it is seen as a fairly standard summary of the treatment that the religious other is to have within a Muslim state, at least in pre-modern times or earlier times. Some of the rules and regulations in this document are related to things like freedom of religion, taxation, certain things non-Muslims must not do, and the like. We will look at this in detail in the class. A question for us is whether these rules that are in the Pact of Omar, whether they were applied always, particularly rules relating to all kinds of restrictions on the non-Muslims under Muslim rule. Some of the rules given in this document can be seen as limiting or restricting the activities that non-Muslims may undertake if they are living in the midst of Muslim societies. These may include restrictions on certain practices, such as ringing of church bells if the church is in the midst of a Muslim neighborhood, or whether they are permitted to sell alcohol and pork, again, most likely if such outlets are going to be in Muslim neighborhoods. The key point to remember is that although such a document seems to provide all kinds of rules and regulations, these regulations were not used or implemented consistently across the board in all Muslim societies, particularly those rules that are about restricting various freedoms for non-Muslims. After the fragmentation of the Muslim Caliphate, that is, after the first 200 years or so of Muslim history, there were many Muslim states, empires, caliphates, and the like. And in all of them, there were always non-Muslims as an integral part of those societies. How a Muslim state dealt with their non-Muslim citizens was often dependent on the circumstances, contexts, and the political and economic situation. Certain rules and regulations may be emphasized at certain times, and the same rules and regulations would be ignored at other times and contexts. Restrictions on certain non-Muslim activities can be visible in some contexts, and in other contexts there may not be a presence of that at all. So the practice varied enormously. Often there was no clear separation between the Muslim communities and non-Muslim communities. There could be all kinds of social interactions, business relations, political alliances, and the like. In quite a lot of Muslim states, non-Muslims rose to very important and powerful positions in the state, even as high as the position of what we might call prime minister. Much depended on what the non-Muslim citizens could contribute to the community and the state as well. It also depended on their skills, the education levels, and the like, and the kind of training they had. The state needed all these skills, and therefore, whether one was Muslim or not, those skills were utilized by the state. By and large, in Muslim societies, non-Muslims were seen as an essential part of the society, and on the whole, they functioned reasonably well as such. This, of course, does not mean that in different periods of Islamic history, some non Muslims in some states were not persecuted or did not have difficult times. But the point is, much depended on the context and not so much on the rules and regulations that we see in documents like the Pact of Omar. We will be looking at different Muslim states and the context in later lectures. This lecture was supposed to be entirely focused on the very earliest period of Islamic history, that is, the time of the Prophet Muhammad and the rightly guided caliphs. So, in summary, in this lecture, I have tried to show that there are examples from the life of Prophet Muhammad and the practice of the earliest Muslim community, which could be used as a basis for positive interreligious relations between Muslims and people of other faiths. We looked at examples of Muslims living under the protection of a non Muslim ruler, a Christian ruler. We looked at the Charter of Medina, the Najran Treaty, and how rightly the Rashidun Caliphs managed Muslim and non Muslim relations, as well as, very briefly, the Pact of Omar. We will be looking at some of these examples as we move through the module or the course in more depth. Thanks for watching. We hope this deepened your understanding of Islam. Be sure to check out the other videos in this series. Keep exploring. Don't forget to subscribe.